Welcome to History Nest, where the past whispers you to sleep. Imagine this. In one of the most revered hallways of the Vatican, you are crouching behind a marble column. Incense and something much more intoxicating filled the air. In 1501 AD, you glimpse what no eye should ever see inside these hallowed walls, through the shadows created by flickering candlers, through the corridors where saints once roamed. The sound of laughter mingles with the rustle of silk against stone. Realizing that you are going to witness the most scandalous evening in papal history makes your heart race. Even the ancient Romans would have blushed in humiliation at such a wicked orgy. The smell of roasted chestnuts permeates the air in the Vatican residences in October. However, these modest nuts will be used as props in a play tonight that will damage the Catholic Church's reputation for all time. 50 courtesans get ready for an evening that will be documented in the most discreet journal of Renaissance Rome, maintained in the Vatican archives for centuries like a prohibited confession, concealed beneath layers of devout prayers in the private quarters of Caesar Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI. If you love learning about the hidden facts of history, think about clicking the like button and subscribing for more content like this before delving into these lost tales of survival and pain. Additionally, kindly let me know where you're listening by leaving a comment below. It's amazing to me that we're studying these old tales from around the globe together, bound together by our mutual interest in the past and transcending time and location. Born in the Spanish town of Chatava, next to Valencia, on January 1st, 1431 AD, Rodrigo Borgia became the most perverted pope in history. His early recollections were clung to by the dust of Spanish highways, but fate would take him far from his modest origins to the marble halls of Vatican power. Alfonso de Baja, his uncle, had already started moving up the clerical ranks, and little Rodrigo's fate was sealed like wax on a paper bull when Alonso was elected. Pope Calixtus III, in 1455 AD, the ancient art of nepotism, which ran through the veins of the church like poison through a dying corpse, was the reason Rodrigo was made a cardinal deacon at the age of 25, with ambition in his heart and hunger in his eyes. The young Spaniard arrived in Rome, prepared to seize any chances the eternal city would present. Dante would have been moved to tears by the inconsistencies that characterized late 15th century Rome. Prayers rose like smoke towards heaven as travelers bowed in adoration before golden altars during the day. The same streets were the scene of nighttime transactions that would make flesh merchants rich beyond their wildest expectations. Everything, including salvation itself, had a price tag engraved in gold ducats, and the papal court had turned into a marketplace. Rodrigo had a deeper understanding of this universe than most. Like a businessman stockpiling rare stones, he amassed a fortune by gathering ecclesiastical benefices around Europe with the systematic accuracy of a spider spinning its web. He was not a man of God. He lived the life of a prince of the Renaissance. Magnificent mansions, lavish banquets, and a string of lovers who gave birth to him as frequently as seasonal crops. Of these, the most important was with Fenard Zacatun, a Roman noblewoman whose beauty was equaled only by her ability to negotiate the perilous waters of papal politics. She gave birth to Rodrigos for children between 1474 and 1482 AD, who, would play key roles in the gloomy drama that was about to take place. Lucia, Gajuan, and Cesare. 4. Rodrigo. Each child was a chess piece in his vast game of dominance. Their lives were sacrificed for their father's unbridled desire. In a city where scandal was as common as morning bread, Rodrigo's actions scandalized Rome, even as a cardinal dot. In 1460 AD, he received a harsh letter from Pope Pius II denouncing actions at Siena that had stunned the entire town and court. However, Rodrigo could not afford the luxury of shame. Moral objections were challenges to be surmounted, not values to be upheld, and he had a papacy to win. The August 1492 AD conclave played out like a meticulously planned corruption dance. 23 cardinals convened behind closed doors in the Sistine Chapel, beneath Michelangelo's future masterpiece, to select the next vicar of Christ. Waters. Fluidity exchanged hands with gold. Benefices were given out like communion wafers, and promises were spoken like prayers. Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander V when the smoke eventually cleared on August 11, 1492 AD. This victory was attained through the purchase and sale of sacred positions, which was openly recognized by his contemporaries as simony. Surprisingly, the Romans celebrated. They were used to their Spanish cardinal and expected a pontificate full of grandeur and vigor. The 7 hills were lit by bonfires. Ancient streets were crisscrossed by torch-like processions, and triumphal arches rose like wood and stone prayers. On August 26th, the new pope was crowned at Testa Peter's Basilica, to what many described as the most enthusiastic reception any pope had ever received. Measures that appeared to promise reform were implemented at the start of Alexander V's reign. In the months leading up to his election, more than 200 killings had taken place in the streets of Rome. He brought order back. He created districts with magistrates who were empowered to keep the peace, personally heard complaints every Tuesday, and administered justice with what modern observers hailed as remarkable effectiveness. For a while, it appeared as though the correct man had been appointed, tossed Peter's throne by divine providence. However, power does not create character. Rather, it reveals it, much like wine does. Alexander's unrelenting quest for progress for his children, especially his sons Juan and Cesario, overshadowed his early initiatives. One married a Spanish king's relative after being appointed Duke of Gandiari in Spain. Even though was only 18, he was named to the influential Archbishop Rick of Valencia and then promoted to cardinal posts, which he viewed as stepping stones rather than holy vocations. During Alexander's rule, the papal quarters were transformed into a theater, where a lewd dance was performed by the sacred and the profane. Late-night dinners were followed by entertainment that even by Renaissance standards went beyond what was considered appropriate. As free-flowing as any cardinal through the Vatican halls was Alexander's Mysteries, whose remarkable beauty earned her the nickname Julia la Bella throughout Rome. Her presence served as a continual reminder that earthly desires had trodden underfoot the Pope's spiritual commitments. With a quill and an unforgiving memory, Johann Burchard entered this realm of contrasts as a careful observer. Having studied canon law and advanced through the ranks of the Church to become the papal master of ceremonies, the priest was born. In need of a hustler's heart, around 1450 AD, he had close access to the most private aspects of papal life. because of his position. Burchard kept what he termed his diarium, a meticulous journal that documented the outrageous behavior of 5 different popes, as well as their splendid celebrations. Starting in 1483 AD, under Popes Sixtus IV, Burchard wasn't sentimental. He had the sight of a court stenographer and the soul of an accountant. With the same meticulousness he used for PayPal scandals, he documented PayPal rights, producing a documentary record that would eventually unnerve even seasoned Vatican archaeisms. In the hierarchy of the Pope, the Master of Ceremonies held a special place. He wasn't low enough to be barred from seeing the corruption, nor was he high enough to take part in it. He passed through the Vatican's most intimate areas, like a candlelight shadow, taking in everything while seeming to have very little significance. Cardinals forgot. He was there when discretion should have won out and confided in him on ceremonial things. His greatest strength as a recorder of papal vice was his obscurity. The actions of the Bura family had started to draw criticism from all throughout Europe by the late 1490s AD. Juan, the eldest son of Alexander, had been made Duke of Gandia, but his elevation wasn't merited, and his character was as corrupt as his position. Rumors spread about his incapacity as a military leader, his sexual excesses, and his harshness. Even his loving father could not overlook the fact that the golden kid of the Bura dynasty was turning into a liability. Everything was altered. On June 14, 1497 AD, the body of a man with 9 wounds and a chopped throat was found floating in the Tiber River. Rome was rocked by the murder, and Alexander was so devastated that onlookers questioned whether divine justice had finally come to the Bura family. The Pope refused to eat or sleep for 3 days and nights. Not the powerful Pope who had once frightened kingdoms, but a broken man weeping in private. Amidst his distress, Alexander declared a plan to restructure the church. He demanded actions to curb papal court extravagance, restructure the apostolic chancery, and curb concubinage and simony. Personal tragedy appeared to have the potential to do what years of criticism had not been able to. Cardinals and canonists formed a commission to prepare ordinances that foreshadowed the Council of Trent reforms, which were still decades away. However, mourning proved to be transient, just like everything else in Alexander's personality. The reform suggestions were forgotten within months, tucked away like young people's awkward love letters. The Pope's focus shifted to his surviving children, especially Cesare, whose fierce desire and unyielding determination would now guide the family's course. Cesare was Alexander's blade, icy, sharp, and completely conscienceless if one had been his heart. Both foes and admirers were drawn to Caesar's charisma. He was tall, good-looking, and had a genius-like brain. Like his father, he had originally been intended for the church, but rather than theology, Caesar's strengths were in statecraft and the military. The first cardinal in history to willingly leave the sacred office and pursue secular authority. He quit his position in 1498 AD. Even would not have been able to imagine the potential that the political climate in Italy offered Cesare. In order to annul his marriage, Louis X, the 12th King of France, required the approval of the Pope. Alexander saw an opportunity to establish a kingdom for his son under these circumstances, even if it meant siding with foreign invaders against fellow Italians. while other Italian duchies were poised to be conquered by a sufficiently brutal commander. Cesare became one of the most powerful men in Europe by establishing a realm in central Italy by a combination of political manipulation, assassination, and siege warfare. Caesar's strategies were so successful that Niccolò Machiavelli, who admired Caesar's capacity to combine efficiency and harshness in the service of political objectives, would later use him as the model for the prince. However, even papal coffers could not readily supply the resources needed for such achievement, so Alexander had to come up with even more inventive ways to raise money. In Alexander's later years, the sale of indulgences, church positions, and even cardinals' caps became organized. Rich families were able to buy their sons' church jobs, thus purchasing both social standing and salvation. As Alexander selected 47 new cardinals throughout his reign, the College of Cardinals grew not because of spiritual merit, but rather because of financial contributions. Every appointment was like thousands after cats pouring into Caesar's war chest from the papal coffers. At this time, Rome seemed like a city occupied by its own rulers, with Caesar as the crown prince and Alexander as the patriarch. The Bura family regarded the papal states as their own country. Lucretia was used as political pawn in marital partnerships that benefited family interests more than her own happiness, even after her reputation was later restored. When political conditions changed, she immediately remarried Alfonso of Bis. This connection no longer suited Boer's interests. During this time, the Vatican apartments were used as a venue for more complex entertainments that went beyond what was considered appropriate. Theatrical shows, musical concerts, and late-night supper parties were all things Alexander loved. Their only similarity to beauty was their discretion or lack thereof. They served as platforms for political negotiations, displays of papal wealth and authority, and tests of loyalty among Alexander's followers. Because they were linked to the Pope's actions, the cardinals who took part in his entertainments were hesitant to criticize or turn on him. Individuals who declined invitations identified themselves as possible adversaries, vulnerable to the same form of retaliation that had befallen so many of Borges's opponents. The Boer family was at its most powerful and possibly corrupt in the autumn of 1501 AD. Military observers from all around Europe praised Caesar for his effective conquest of the Romagna. Alexander had survived a number of political upheavals. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims had flocked to Rome during the Jubilee year of 1500, bringing equal numbers of people to the city's brothel and the papal coffers. Cesare Bura came up with the idea for what would be known as the Banquet of Chestnuts in this era of victory and moral decadence. Uncertainty surrounds the event's precise motivation. Was it political theater, celebration, or just the inevitable conclusion of years of ever more obscene behavior? Although modern sources provide different interpretations, they all concur on the crucial details that would surprise even the most knowledgeable observers of papal vice. The line between the sacred and the profane was traditionally thought to be at its thinnest on October 31st, 1501. Freely among the living could have been a purposeful choice, or just a coincidence. Regardless, the symbolism was flawless. The Bauer family was ready to carry out actions that would destroy what little papal dignity remained on a night honoring the fallen, a portion of the papal palace which had been exquisitely embellished. by Pinturicchio in the early years of Alexander's rule, was occupied by Kaiser's rooms in the Vatican. Scenes from Christian history and classical mythology were painted on the frescoed walls, providing a humorous setting for actions that are not part of either faith. Instead, attained by the burghers was demonstrated by the evening's guest list. Roman aristocrats whose wealth had bought them silence on past papal scandals, mixed with cardinals who ought to have been praying that evening. Attending diplomats from other European courts may have been motivated by curiosity about how far the burghers would stretch the bounds of proper conduct. Or they may have seen the evening as a chance to learn more about the papal intentions. The 50 courtesans Cesare had gathered for his guests' amusement, however, were the real stars of the evening. These were intelligent ladies who knew the delicate skill of giving pleasure while keeping the discretion that powerful men demanded. Not simple prostitutes plucked from the streets of Rome. Many had attended papal entertainments before. They were aware of the expectations placed on them by their powerful clients and the norms of engagement. In his role as master of ceremonies, Johann Burchard was there that night as an observer rather than a participant. Even during private entertainments, he had to be accessible for any ceremonial activities that could come up as part of his official duties. He was in a unique position to observe and document occurrences that other witnesses might have wished to forget because of this professional duty. Written in Latin and with the clinical objectivity of a medical examiner, his report retains details that shed light on the particular events of that night, as well as the moral atmosphere of Alexander's pontificate. As to Richard's thorough documentation, the evening started off in a traditional manner, with supper being served in Caesar's personal quarters. Wines from the papal vendors that had been meticulously matured in Roman caves complemented the feast, which included delicacies suitable for the time of year and the guests' social standing. As easily as the wine, the conversation flowed, touching on subjects like politics, military operations, and patronage of the arts, all of which gave the gathered party a chance to show off their cultural expertise. As servants swept away the dinner plates and the real entertainment of the evening began, the mood started to shift. The 50 courtesans, clad in velvets and silks that had been meticulously chosen to best showcase their physical characteristics, started dancing for the guests. The beats produced by musicians who had been sworn to secrecy regarding the events of the evening promoted ever closer movement. Even the expansive notions of proper conduct that had developed under Iskander's pontificate were called into question by what transpired next. The women danced wearing clothing at first, but as the evening wore on and the wine flowed, the clothing was gradually thrown away until the performers were fully nude, as Bard documented with great accuracy. This shift from traditional entertainment to overt display happened slowly enough for attendees to acclimatize to their comfort levels, but firmly enough that nobody could pretend to be unaware of the evening's final course. The banquet was named for the chestnuts, which were the main attraction of the event. Candelabras were taken off the dining tables by the servants and scattered on the floor across the room, forming pools of flickering light and patches of shadow. The naked courtesans were told to crawl on their hands and knees to gather the chestnuts that were strewn all over the floor between these light sources. They navigated the makeshift obstacle course with their bodies lit by candles. Burchard recounts that Pope Alexander V accompanied by Caesar and Lucretia, observed these events from a place of honor, or a willing participant in family corruption. Although modern sources give differing accounts, they all concur that she was there as the night reached its peak of depravity. Prizes were given away, along with silk tunics, shoes, barrettes, and other luxuries that were highly valuable during a time when most of these products were handcrafted. Intimate human connection was turned into a spectacle for PayPal entertainment when the competitions were held in public and servants kept score of each competitor's performance. For centuries, Gahard's description of these events was kept hidden from the public in the Vatican's secret archives. In particular, Pope Leo XII was reluctant to grant access to records that could harm. Such prudence was required over 4 centuries after the events detailed, indicating the scandal's lasting impact that Gahard had meticulously chronicled. Spiritual underpinnings had undergone a significant transformation. Pilgrims kept coming, tossed Peter's Basilica for services. Cardinals went about their meetings and rituals as planned, while the Pope himself made public appearances as though nothing noteworthy had happened. However, word of what had happened the night before got out through the city's network of guards, servants, and lower-level officials who had heard or seen the PayPal orgy. Through the diplomatic correspondence of foreign ambassadors who had either attended the banquet or heard about it from trustworthy sources, word of the event spread outside of Rome. The astonishment and disgust of witnesses who had assumed they were immune to surprise at PayPal behavior are documented in letters that have been preserved in European archives, who have their own courts with a great deal of moral flexibility. The scandal's political ramifications went well beyond ethical considerations. Reports of the banquet were seized upon by reformers across Europe, including individuals such as Gerald Movenera in Florence, as proof that the papacy itself had become irredeemably corrupt. With the help of in-depth reports of his actions that appeared to corroborate the most serious charges against the Pope of Bura, calls for church councils to remove Alexander V, sixth gained fresh immediacy. Alexander's reaction to criticism was combative as usual. Instead of expressing regret or enacting changes, he continued to live with the same beautiful luxury that had defined his whole pontificate, and stepped up his support for Caesar's military efforts. If anything, the controversy appeared to release him from whatever constraints had previously confined his actions, as though the public recognition of his corruption relieved him of the need to preserve even a semblance of respectability. Although the chestnut banquet took place close to the end of Alexander's pontificate, it was not the only instance of moral failings. Rather, it was the inevitable conclusion of years of gradually increasing corruption that had changed the PayPal court into something that would have been unthinkable to earlier Christian generations. The sacred and the profane had gotten so entangled that it was difficult to tell them apart, and few were prepared to do so. In the immediate aftermath of the controversy, Savar Borger's career flourished, indicating that political calculations in Renaissance Italy were not significantly impacted by moral anger. Observers who valued effectiveness, regardless of the personal qualities of those who accomplished it, continued to commend his military accomplishments. In his subsequent critique of Savara's strategies, Machiavelli made a clear distinction between political acumen and moral character, contending that effective leaders must be prepared to use any means required to accomplish their goals. However, success based on such pillars turned out to be on August 18, 1503 AD, Alexander passed away, presumably from malaria. His children saw direct repercussions from his passing. Without papal protection, Caesar's political backing vanished, and 4 years later, he was killed in battle in Spain as a common mercenary. Lucretia lived to become the Duchess of Ferrara, but the scandals of her childhood and her family's infamous notoriety overshadowed her latter years. The dinner of chestnuts had been held at the Bouillere quarters, which the new pope, Julius II, refused to inhabit. He relocated to quarters on the floor above, and he hired Raphael to paint frescoes that would go on to become some of the most renowned pieces of art in Vatican history. This actual move represented a larger effort to disassociate the Pope from the immoralities of Alexander's rule. Historical evaluations of the Supper of Chestnuts have changed depending on the political and moral atmosphere of succeeding centuries, even if the damage to the papal reputation was more difficult to repair than damaged apartments. The truth of Burchard's narrative was frequently contested by Catholic historians of the 19th and early 20th centuries, have recorded such severe behavior. Protestant historians, on the other hand, use the scandal as proof for their critiques of Catholic claims to moral leadership and papal authority, while contextualizing Burchard's story within the larger framework of Renaissance Italian society. Contemporary historians generally acknowledge its basic authenticity. They point out that public entertainments involving prostitutes and sexual displays were common among secular rulers of the time. So Alexander's actions were shocking, mainly because he was the head of the Catholic Church, and not because such behavior was unheard of in modern society. The banquet's architectural context gives the events of that classical mythology in the halls where theurgies took place. A visual commentary on the gap between artistic ideals and human reality was created as images that would have scandalized both pagan and Christian sensibilities played out. With ancient gods and saints gazing down from painted walls, the actual layout of the Vatican apartments has been uncovered by archaeological investigations, which helps to explain how such events might take place inside the papal residence. Multiple chambers connected by hallways were incorporated into the design of the Burj flats to accommodate both private and public entertainment. The privacy required for Alexander's more extreme behavior was provided by soundproofing between rooms, which meant that events in one area might not be audible in adjacent places. Burchard's diary's retention in the Vatican's secret archives begs the question of how the Church views its own past. Only a small group of scholars with specific clearance from papal authority were able to access these manuscripts, which were sealed for centuries. The choice to preserve such documents while limiting access to them suggests both discomfort about their contents and an understanding of their historical significance. At least one version of the events reported is supported by contemporary narratives from sources other than Burchard. References to papal entertainments that go beyond what is considered appropriate behavior can be found in diplomatic letters from the time. The convergence of several sources leading to similar conclusions enhances the case for believing the Banquet of Chestnuts' core historicity. Even though few sources offer the specific details that make Burchard's narrative so convincing, the immediate political ramifications of the scandal are not the only way to gauge its influence on later papal history. Protestant reformers claimed that the Pope had become irredeemably corrupt as a result of Alexander V's actions, which culminated in incidents like the Banquet of well-recorded instances of moral failings at the highest echelons of the church hierarchy gave Martin Luther's critiques of papal authority legitimacy. Scandals, such as the Banquet of Chestnuts, prompted the Counter-Reformation that started in the middle of the 6th century. Church officials understood that in order to combat Protestant attacks and regain papal credibility, moral reform was required. The Council of Trent tackled issues that had been vividly depicted by Alexander V's 6th century behavior by emphasizing clerical discipline and establishing seminaries for priestly education. However, reform came at a price that went beyond simple adjustments to policy. By using artistic beauty and meticulously planned ritual, the Baroque grandeur of post-Tridentine papal festivities attempted to restore dignity to papal authority. Formal presentations intended to highlight papal magnificence while reducing the likelihood of controversy replaced the impromptu entertainments that had defined Alexander's court. From a historical perspective, it is still challenging to evaluate the psychological effects of occasions like the Banquet of Chestnuts on both participants and onlookers. The courtesans that performed that night most likely saw the experience as a professional duty rather than a sign of personal failure. Due to their social standing, such employment was not a moral decision, but rather an economic necessity. With the risk of professional reprisals, the event might have symbolized either grudging compliance with papal demands or willing involvement in corruption for the church officials in attendance. The complicated link between popular faith and ecclesiastical authority is revealed by the reaction of the Roman populace as a whole to information about papal behavior. The sacramental system persisted, masses were still celebrated, and pilgrims still flocked to Rome in spite of the general knowledge of Alexander's moral failings. This implies that the theological sophistication of popular Catholicism was advanced enough to differentiate between the legitimacy of church leaders' religious roles and their personal deservingness. There is more to the Banquet of Chestnuts than a single instance of papal wrongdoing. It sheds light on Italy's wider transition from medieval Christianity to the early modern European political structure during the Renaissance. The values of secular princes who displayed their power through extravagance and luxury were reflected in Alexander V's 6th century actions. However, his role as Catholic Christianity's spiritual leader led to inconsistencies that were eventually untenable. Thus, the night of October 31st, 1501 AD, is remembered as a turning point in papal history, the moment when the conflict between temporal power and spiritual authority became so urgent that it needed to be resolved. The controversy compelled succeeding popes to make a decision that would influence the evolution of the Catholic Church for centuries to come. Between moral respectability and worldly grandeur, reflections of humanity's never-ending conflict between sacred ambitions and profane cravings can be seen. When we go back over 5 centuries to that candlelit evening in the Vatican apartments, the modest chestnuts that were strewn all over the marble floors of the papal chambers came to represent the extent to which human dignity may be undermined when authority is unchecked. The dinner of chestnuts serves as both a historical scandal and a timeless warning in a world where such contrasts still exist, where spiritual leaders occasionally let their people down, and where power corrupts even those dedicated to higher reasons. Long ago extinguished are the candles that lit up that infamous night. The participants have been reduced to dust in Roman graves, and the rooms where these scenes took place are now adorned with priceless artwork for tourists to admire. However, those instances where the line between the sacred and the profane, completely blurred, are preserved by Burchard's meticulous Latin prose. When chestnuts strewn across marble floors testified to the gap between human ambition and divine calling, and when the victor of Christ became indistinguishable from the most dissolute Roman emperor, as a mirror reflecting the perpetual human propensity for both transcendence and degradation, rather than as proof of personal moral failing. Perhaps that is the true significance of Alexander V's forbidden orgy, the same species that produced magnificent religious art and towering cathedrals, also congregated in PayPal rooms to watch performances that called into question the fundamental basis of spiritual authority. Before daybreak, the chestnuts scattered on those Vatican floors were collected. However, the issues they raise on authority, religion, and human nature persist throughout history, awaiting the next generation to determine how to interpret the legacy of the most perverse pope who ever professed to have the keys to heaven. If you enjoyed this journey through history, make sure to subscribe to History Nest, where every night a new story takes flight.